like there was that party in the 1850s called the Know Nothings. So Lincoln is the first Republican president. It's not all the Know Nothings, but certain numbers of the Know Nothings go into the new Republican Party, and the Know Nothings were like virulently anti-Catholic. I mean, they just did not, and there had been the rise of the Know Nothings was relatively brief, but it was in the 1850s, so it's it's not very far from the Civil War, and it's big in cities where the Irish are in large numbers. So the likes of New York, by far the biggest, and Philly is the second, and then on down through the list. And so like they see that, and the Democrats were the ones who said, "Oh, hang on, the Irish are a good vote here. We'll start to nurture them along." And we look back in things now, and it is, I'm a big fan of Lincoln, but you look back now, and it's very easy, I think, in hindsight, to look at these things in a very kind of a black and white version of events. There's the good people and there's the bad people, but things are a lot different, particularly if you're somebody who's really living on the margins of society, like white working class urban people were in these cities. Like their living conditions could be really challenging.
That was Damian Shields, author of the book Green and Blue, Irish Americans in the Union Military, 1861 to 1865, Conflicting Worlds, New Dimensions of the American Civil War, from episode 109 of the Irish Baseball Podcast. Hello, and welcome to episode 111 of the Irish Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Becker. On the show today, I will continue my conversation with Damian Shields from that exact point. Let's not waste any time and welcome Damian to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks a million for having me on, Rick. I appreciate it.
Is there any record of politicians like Abraham Lincoln and some of these other high-ranking Republicans who maybe did talk poorly about Catholic immigrants, or maybe did have these views that they weren't really American, that as the Irish showed through the Civil War that they were willing to fight for the preservation of the Union, that these politicians did start to change their views of the Irish?
So not really is the answer to that. Lincoln himself wasn't anti-Irish, really. Yeah, he and a lot of Republicans, I think it would be we should say, weren't anti-Irish. There were elements of the party of it. But what the good, I suppose, that the Irish had done in enlisting in the war in such large numbers was undone, in large part because of the New York City draft riots of 1863, which when the draft is starting, if any of your listeners have seen Gangs in New York, that's a major element of that movie, when the draft riots occur. And they're largely, because most of the population in Manhattan are Irish, they're largely Irish, and they attack African Americans. They actually attack other Irish. They attack Irish military guys as well. They attack institutions. And because of that, there was a substantial enough among the press, among politicians, indeed among army officers, portion of people who didn't like the Irish before, during, and after the war, and that was kind of negatively impacted kind of the positive spin of the numbers of service, where the Irish really win, if you like, in inverted commas, that war is in the war of memory. So, like, as we know, by the late 19th century, there's a whole new wave of immigrants coming in from Eastern Europe, from Italy, from places like that into the cities. And during the Civil War, the only two major immigrant groups, were the Germans and the Irish. And so the Irish were able to look back, say in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, they were able to look back and say, well, all these new immigrants, they weren't here for America's greatest crisis, but we were. And so they're putting up the monuments to Irish participation, and they're writing about it. And there's things about the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Fredericksburg, where everybody comes together, and the anniversary of Gettysburg and things like that. And so really, because they're able to differentiate themselves from other groups like that, the memory of the war in the long term does have a big impact. But I mean, one of the things I discuss in the book is the relationship of guys that ordinary soldiers in the army had with people who were anti-Irish. So like what happened if your officer was anti-Irish or anti-Catholic? Like you could be in for a fairly hard time. And what you see is sometimes if you were an enlisted Irish man, you were more likely to be punished for, say, drinking or for perceived disciplinary issues than if you weren't Irish, right? So there's been statistics done by historians on that. But what you kind of see, I actually use an example. There's a regiment called the 20th Massachusetts. They're called the Harvard Regiment, so you kind of get an idea of where their officers are drawn from. But they had some Irish companies in it, and one of their officers in charge of this was just he hated the working class and Irish people. He just did not like them at all. But you see during the war, as he gets to know these men a bit more, that when they're killed and stuff, he'll write to their wives or discuss their children, that it moderates. Now, it moderates his dislike for them. And so he never becomes a fan of the Irish, like he doesn't like immigrants generally, but that's kind of the most common experience, this kind of low-level moderation, because guys have built up this esprit de corps in the military with each other, that it becomes more tolerant. But unfortunately, it goes straight through. I mean, you see it into the 1870s and everything. So it's kind of a longer term win, if you like, that level of service.
So at the very beginning of this podcast, I guess it was more than 4 years ago now, I did an interview with the author of a book about when Irish Americans invaded Canada. And tried to take over a portion of Canada and use it as a bargaining chip for freedom in Ireland. And that's not necessarily what I want to talk about now, but what you see happening is maybe some of these Irish Americans who got experience fighting in the Spanish-American War, the Civil War, some of these other conflicts maybe out west, and they were in the U.S. military, and not only were they learning how to ingratiate themselves into American society, not only were they getting good paying jobs, but some of them started to turn their attention from fighting to preserve the Union or fighting to, clear out the West, and they started turning that attention to the freedom of Ireland, to Ireland breaking away from under British control. And I want to know, did the Civil War and all of these Irish Americans who fought in it, did that have some impact 50, 60, 70 years later in the battle for independence?
It does, and I will definitely chat about that now in a second. And actually, we're around the anniversaries of the 1867 Fenian Rising, which I'll mention too, just in a minute. I will say this in relation to the Fenian movement, which is that movement, these guys who believe in using physical force to get an Irish Republic in this period. And it normally gets an awful lot of attention. It's often said to be like one of the main motivators or a major motivator for Irish enlistment. So I had a really hard look at that, and I found that actually it wasn't. That very, very few men enlisted in the Union military during the Civil War because they wanted to get military experience for the Fenian movement. And if you look at a lot of the guys who were involved in things like the Fenians who come back to Ireland, most of them, nearly all of them, in fact, are officers. That the enlisted men don't do it so much. That actually their main interest in Ireland is getting money to get their family to come over. That's their number one interest. I mean, they are supporting the Fenian movement, and they probably give money to it, and they go to meetings and things, but they're not necessarily interested in fighting. But that said, and so I discussed that element in the book, but it is the guys who do get involved in the Fenian invasion of Canada or coming back to Ireland do have a major impact. If you look, the 1867 Fenian Rising was a bit of a disaster in Ireland. it didn't really go anywhere. One of the problems with that is you had a bunch of Irish officers who were just out of the Union Army, who were hopping off the boat in Dublin, still wearing, revolvers around and wearing these American boots and stuff like this. And the British were just picking them up straight off the boat effectively. And they put a load of them actually in prison, and there are mugshots of these guys. Loads of them are veteran officers of things like the Irish Brigade and the Irish Legion and things like that. But if you look at the proclamation that the Fenians put out immediately after in 67, which the 1916 proclamation draws upon, it's using the American, it's using the United States declarations as a kind of an inspiration. The flag that the Fenians use in 1867, is based on the American flag and everything. And I used to live in East Cork. And again, to talk about identity and everything, there's during the Napoleonic Wars, they built these round, that they're called Martello Towers, all over Ireland to kind of defend against French invasion. And there was the only one that was ever successfully attacked was taken in the 1867 Fenian invasion, when 3 lads in a rowboat came up and took it. But the guy who was in charge of that was a New York-born American Civil War veteran. He had come back specifically just to be involved in it. And they put Civil War officers, guys with military experience, were in charge of a lot of the districts. So by the time 1916 comes around, and you'll read it if you're reading about kind of guys who fought in the Irish War of Independence and stuff, they'll talk about the local Fenians in their area and things like that, and all that. I mean, so it has a massive impact. There's no question of it. But in terms of the actual Civil War itself, I think very few people are actually enlisting going. I discuss it, there's one of the guys, he served in a New York unit called the New York Irish Rifles. And he gives a speech when he gets promoted to the officer, and he talks about going back to Ireland when this is over. He says all that, and he's writing to his father, and he said, I spoke about us going back to Ireland and all that sort of thing, kind of this. But when it came to it, he re-enlisted in the US regulars, and he was killed at Spotsylvania Courthouse in the US in 1864 with the US regulars. He didn't look to go back the minute he got some experience. So it's really interesting, but it certainly was very important at different levels for a lot of those guys.
Yeah, I guess that I never really thought that they were joining the Union Army or either side of the army as a preparation, but I guess I was wondering if it brought up these thoughts of, well, if we can help this power at this point, the United States was a power by this time, if we can help them preserve their union, maybe there could be some thoughts of independence for Ireland.
Well, and there's no doubt, Rick, and we forget it sometimes today because Britain and the US have been allied for so long that in the 1860s, they weren't good mates. There'd obviously been the American Revolution, and then there had been the War of 1812, and there had been consistent diplomatic problems. And so the Irish look at, and that's, of course, and I'm sure you discussed that in the Fenian invasion of Canada. I mean, that's a big thing there. The Irish are trying to spark an issue between Britain and America. And so the Irish and people, that's a big motivator for preserving the Union for a lot of guys is, we need to protect the American Republic, not only because it's somewhere we can transpose our communities in Ireland, but also they're the ones who can help us with the future of Ireland politically. Whether or not they were going to go back or not, a lot of people were interested in it. And so it was absolutely vital for that because of its power. And the Fenians actually, those guys who get arrested, they play a big role. A lot of them who do get arrested are put on trial in Dublin. And then, of course, a lot of them claim American citizenship because they served in the Civil War. And that's one of the sparks that creates Britain finally accepting that people who were born in Britain and Ireland could change their allegiance to the United States, if they went there, that they could become a citizen. Because before that, the British, they denied that anybody could do that, which was one of the reasons the War of 1812 was fought. So, but yeah, it's a fascinating subject, that the lads coming back and that influence that the mid-19th century United States has on Ireland.
Well, and you mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation. And a big part of Lincoln making that proclamation was he was scared, and with good reason, that England would join with the Confederacy in this war, and then it would have been over. And Lincoln thought, if I change the world view of this from preserving the Union to being the elimination of slavery, going to make it impossible for England to join on the side of the Confederacy. I mean, that was a big part keeping England out of this. And I think the Irish had to know that even though they weren't an official ally of the Confederacy, that the English were buying goods.
They were building ships, in British ports. Yeah, I mean, I think Lincoln was looking. I mean, Lincoln was keen to bring forward emancipation, but it gave him the opportunity, and it certainly didn't hurt. Like after that, there was no way Britain really was going to because, which is shows you why Antietam was so important, as an engagement. As you bring it up, I do have to mention it's one of the letters I talk in the book. It's a young lad called John Corcoran, who again. One of the things I discuss in the book is how Irish Americans are not just Irish born. There are American born Irish Americans, but a lot of the people that we look at in the Civil War who were born in Canada or Britain saw themselves as Irish as well. And this young lad, John Corcoran, who gets killed in the war, but he was born in England, and he is campaigning in Virginia when there is talk that the British are going to recognize the Confederacy. And he goes crazy. Well, number one, he starts going on about Orange men and stuff like that, and says, "Oh, any of those guys trying to avoid being recruited into the Union Army must all be Orange men, because like any proper Irishman would, as he called them, proper Irishmen would enlist." But then he says, "You may feel that I'm too hard to say this against the country of my birth, but if England recognizes," I'm paraphrasing, "recognize the Confederacy, if I catch any of the red rascals," he said that he would kill them, like any English guys wandering around the place. But Ireland, and he talks then about the Great Ireland and everything. But in the very next sentence, he talks about how he's willing to die for the United States to get to Richmond. It's on to Richmond. And he does die for the United States. But it shows you, like, they're very clued into what's going on. Right? That's it. That was earlier in 1862 he wrote that letter. And he wasn't having it anyway.
Well, Damian Shields, that's one of the reasons that your book has interested me so much, is we can hear these things through statistics and we can hear them through government documents. But when you're going straight to the source like this, you're getting these stories about individual soldiers and what they thought about this conflict and why they wanted to take up arms for the United States. And we might not like, in our modern sensibilities, some of the reasons why they did it. We might want to look back on them and say, they were riding for emancipation the entire.
Yeah.
But in the long run, they found themselves on the right side of history, and they had real, legitimate reasons to fight in this war. And I will say, if I'm going to give them a little credit from a different time, they could have easily overlooked all the benefits of fighting for the North and just let their feelings about African Americans impact their decision, and they didn't do that.
No, and I think it's important to say that it wasn't important enough an issue for them that when the Emancipation Proclamation comes in, that they all leave. Like Corcoran's Irish Legion, they don't go to the front until after that. So there's huge enlistment after it. And if it was the primary, if they were going, so you'll often see that the Irish community just a lot of the Irish community didn't have an interest in the war because of that. But like massive numbers of these guys are still enlisting after it. So it's not a primary. Preserving the United States, and a lot of them you can see like guys who become veteran volunteers, they re-enlist and everything. And there are definitely some of them who turn into that group, who see that it is, emancipation is important because it helps to win the war apart from anything else. But yeah, like and you get this big spread of guys, like as I was saying, there are guys straight off the boat who are saying, like there's a guy now, he's serving on the naval blockade, a guy called Patrick Finan from County Sligo, and he's writing back to his dad. And to talk about how long communications can take. He was off Charleston on a Union vessel, and every couple of weeks he's getting letters back and forth from his dad in Sligo town, who's telling him about sheep running over the hills and everything, and telling him about the neighbours. And the dad is inquiring about one of the neighbours' sons, who's a Confederate artilleryman in Charleston. But he finds out, Finan, who came during the war, that about the that they're going to start drafting guys more or less once they declare that they want to become citizens when they land. And he says they should be drafted them the second they step off the boat. If they want to come here to this country, that they should fight to protect the country and not just be like looking to try and take advantage, which is incredible, like for someone like that. So you can see that kind of depth of feeling.
That was Damian Shields, author of the book Green and Blue, Irish Americans in the Union Military, 1861 to 1865, Conflicting Worlds, New Dimensions of the American Civil War. I'm your host, Rick Becker, and this has been episode 111 of the Irish Baseball Podcast.